The first sound that filled the barracks was not fear or grief, but laughter. In the autumn of 1944, as transport trucks rolled into a POW camp in Texas, dozens of captured German soldiers leaned against the wooden fence and erupted in mockery. Their target was not the guards themselves, but the helmets that sat on their heads, wide, round, almost comical. The American M1 helmets seemed to the prisoners like upturned cooking pots. One prisoner, a lanky infantryman from Bavaria, nudged his comrade and whispered loudly enough for others to hear. The Americans march into war as if they were carrying soup. The remark was met with howls of derision to men who had been raised under the iron silhouette of the Stahlhelm. These helmets looked like theater props rather than tools of war. The German soldiers had worn their helmets through the campaigns of Poland, France, and Russia, believing them to be the very crown of modern battlefield engineering. The M1, by contrast, seemed absurd. In the dusty glare of the Texan sun, its smooth dome reflected light in a way that to them screamed vulnerability. Prisoners clutched their ribs as they laughed, pointing and gesturing, their voices carrying across the yard. The guards, young Americans barely out of training, ignored the mockery. They had heard it before from earlier groups of prisoners. One of them, Private William H. Carter of Ohio, tightened the strap beneath his chin and muttered under his breath, "Let them laugh. Better a soup pot than a coffin." He remembered his own father's words when the helmet had first been issued. The M1 didn't look proud, but it saved lives. Those words, spoken in a kitchen over morning coffee before shipping out, echoed now against the jeering of men who still clung to their sense of superiority. What the Germans could not see was the hidden history of those helmets. By 1944, American factories had produced over 22 million M1 helmets, stamping them out of manganese steel and shipping them in crates across oceans and battlefronts. The U.S. War Department valued function over form, and each helmet was designed to deflect shrapnel and ricochet bullets, not to strike fear by appearance. Yet to the POWs, all of this was invisible. They saw only the comical shape and projected their arrogance upon it. In one corner, a young corporal scribbled in a small diary that had escaped confiscation. His entry that night captured the mood. "We laughed today at the ridiculous helmets of the Americans. We laughed so hard our sides hurt. It felt good to laugh at something. But perhaps we laughed because we feared to cry. Beneath the bravado, even in mockery, was a hint of unease for the prisoners. The helmet was a joke for the Americans. It was a shield. Between those two meanings lay a gulf that would soon collapse in the most unexpected way. If you value stories like this, don't forget to like and subscribe. It helps preserve forgotten chapters of history. And as you listen, share your location and your local time in the comments, because history is always more alive when we know where and when it is being heard. The laughter of that first day lingered for weeks, in the barracks at night. The German POWs would sit on their bunks and mimic the round American helmet with overturned bowls or tin cups, sending waves of chuckles through the dim light. Pride in the Stahlhelm ran deep to them. The steel helmet of Germany was more than protection, it was identity. The Stahlhelm had been born in the trenches of 1916, when the old spiked Pickelhaube had proven worthless against shell fragments. By the time of the Second World War, its angular, flared design had become a symbol of terror, etched into the memories of those who had seen Wehrmacht columns marching through European towns. To the prisoners, even in defeat, this helmet still carried a sacred aura. One sergeant from Hamburg boasted during a heated conversation, "The Stahlhelm is not just steel, it is our tradition. Our soldiers in France marched under its shadow. In Russia." The sun glinted off its curve as we advanced. His voice trembled slightly with nostalgia, but others nodded in agreement. For men who had lost everything, clinging to pride and design was a way to preserve dignity. In contrast, the American M1 looked plain and democratic. It lacked the grim angles of the German helmet, and to POW eyes, it seemed as if anyone could wear it. They compared it unfavorably to the disciplined, fearsome image of Wehrmacht soldiers in propaganda posters. "Ugly," muttered one prisoner. "Round like a child's toy," another added. "It makes them look shorter, weaker." Such remarks drew bursts of laughter, and even the guards caught fragments of their ridicule drifting across the yard. What they did not say aloud, though some thought in silence, was how many German dead they had seen with the Stahlhelm beside them, dented or pierced. Yet even that knowledge was wrapped in pride. Better to die with the crown of German steel than to live under what they saw as a clumsy American contraption. The pride was not baseless. Statistics supported their belief. By 1944, German factories had produced more than 20 million Stahlhelms. Their heavy profiles standardized across armies on every front. The helmets had withstood cold on the Eastern Front, sand in North Africa, and mud in Italy. For soldiers who had marched thousands of kilometers with that weight pressing down on their skulls, it had become an extension of their very flesh. In the camp's mess hall, conversations about the helmets sometimes replaced talk of home or family. It was safer, less painful, to argue about steel than to recall wives or children. One POW joked bitterly, "Our helmets were heavier because they carried our pride." Others laughed, but it was a laughter tinged with melancholy. That pride, however, was about to collide with reality, just as the Germans believed their Stahlhelm invincible. Fate prepared to stage a small demonstration that would shatter their certainty. It happened on an afternoon heavy with heat, the kind that slowed the air and carried every sound like an echo. The German prisoners lounged in the yard of the Texas camp, some cleaning their clothes, others idly smoking or carving small figures from scraps of wood, or something. Their laughter over the American helmets had grown routine, a joke that seemed to never lose its sharp edge. On the other side of the fence, a squad of American guards prepared for a training exercise. Rifles were checked, commands barked, and the metallic clink of equipment carried across the open space. The prisoners leaned closer to the wire, hungry for a distraction from their monotony. They whispered among themselves, mocking the way the guards adjusted the straps of their soup pot helmets. Then came the sound that silenced them all, a crack of gunfire. Sharp and unmistakable, a stray bullet from the drill had broken free. The line of sight carried it not toward the sky or an empty field, but directly toward a young guard standing only a dozen paces from the fence. Time seemed to freeze. A ripple of expectation swept through the prisoners. Some drew in their breath, already imagining the terrible sight of blood spraying across the dusty ground. One muttered under his breath, "Now we shall see what the cooking pot is worth." A nervous chuckle rose from another, quickly stifled by the gravity of what was unfolding. The bullet whistled through the yard. The guard. Private Carter again. The same Ohio farm boy who had muttered about coffins weeks earlier had no time to move. His rifle was slung casually, his posture relaxed, unaware until the last second that death was rushing toward him. The German prisoners leaned forward against the wire, eyes wide. For once, no one laughed. Among them, a former artillery officer named Hans Becker later recorded the moment in his confiscated diary. "We believed we were about to see the farce come to its end, a ridiculous helmet and a dead man to prove us right. Instead, history decided to play another trick. The silence was thick, the anticipation unbearable. In that instant, pride and arrogance hovered on the edge of collapse, waiting for the sound that would confirm or deny everything they had believed. The stage was set for steel to speak louder than laughter. The crack of steel against lead shattered the silence. The bullet struck the dome of Private Carter's helmet with a metallic snap, so sharp it echoed like a hammer blow on an anvil. Instead of piercing through flesh and bone, the round skidded off the curved surface and spun away into the dust. For a breathless second, the young guard swayed, his knees buckling under the shock. Then he steadied himself, wide-eyed but alive. Every prisoner froze. Their eyes darted to the helmet, half expecting to see a hole punched clean through. Instead, there was only a fresh dent, glinting under the Texan sun like a scar that told a story. Carter raised his hand slowly to touch the mark, then looked around, realizing what had happened. His lips moved. Though no words came, he had just seen death brush past and felt it sing against steel on the other side of the fence. The Germans exchanged stunned glances. For weeks they had ridiculed those round helmets as toys, pots, jokes. Now one had absorbed the impossible. An older POW whispered hoarsely, "Unmöglich," impossible. His comrades said nothing. Some stared at the ground, unable to meet each other's eyes. Others watched the helmet with a mixture of awe and disbelief. Private Carter, still trembling, adjusted the strap beneath his chin. A fellow guard clapped his shoulder and muttered, "Lucky it was the M1." The words drifted toward the prisoners, who could not avoid hearing them. Their laughter had collapsed into silence, replaced by the heavy recognition that their mockery had just been undone by a single shot. For a moment the camp seemed suspended, as if history itself paused to listen. The dent in that helmet was more than metal bent by force. It was proof, a physical rebuke to arrogance, a demonstration that survival often rests not in symbols of pride but in unseen engineering. Later that night, Becker wrote again in his diary, "The American boy stood. The bullet did not take him. We could not laugh anymore. The sound of that ricochet will follow me until the end of my life." The image of a single dent, gleaming faintly in the fading sun, stayed in every mind. It was not victory or defeat. It was revelation, and it marked the beginning of a quiet unraveling of German certainty inside the wire. By the next morning, the story of the ricochet had already spread across the barracks like wildfire. Prisoners who had not witnessed it firsthand demanded details, and those who had stood at the fence the day before retold the moment again and again. Each time the tale grew sharper, more precise: the snap of the bullet, the staggering of the guard, the dent that gleamed in the sun. Even the habitual mockers fell quiet when the account reached its conclusion. The Americans, for their part, treated it almost casually. A sergeant explained to one of the POWs, half in jest, that the M1 was never meant to look beautiful. It was made to survive. He said simply. Word of this conversation filtered back into the barracks, sparking uneasy discussions among the Germans. Some prisoners scoffed, insisting the event was a fluke. Others, more thoughtful, shook their heads. In the camp workshop, where POWs were sometimes put to work repairing fences or building crates, the helmets became the subject of whispered speculation. One young mechanic among them studied the dent with interest when the guard passed by. He muttered in disbelief, "Light alloy steel." But it held. "Perhaps this is not foolish design, but clever." His remark was met with silence from men who had once laughed with him. The Americans themselves seemed indifferent. To them, helmets were just equipment, one more piece of mass production in a war that demanded millions of units. By 1945, U.S. industry had produced over 22 million M1 helmets, shipped in crates from Pittsburgh mills to Pacific Islands, from New Jersey factories to Normandy beaches. They were stamped out in minutes, painted, strapped, and issued without ceremony. Function, not pride, defined their existence for the German prisoners. However, the dent became a symbol. They had believed survival came from weight and intimidation, from the heavy silhouette of the Stahlhelm. Now they realized the Americans had designed something different, a helmet that turned bullets aside. That relied on subtle angles rather than thickness. It was humbling to admit, but slowly some of them began to respect what they once mocked. One former Luftwaffe auxiliary wrote in a letter that was never sent home, "We laughed at the pot on their heads, yet the pot saved one of them." It is strange how laughter can turn to silence in an instant. The words were tucked away in his belongings, a private confession he dared not speak aloud in front of his comrades. Here, at last. The pride of German engineering began to waver. The Americans had revealed that survival did not depend on appearances. It depended on knowledge, on industry, and on the humility to design for life rather than image. And I will ask you, the audience, if you had stood at that fence, watching steel deflect death, would you have admitted your mistake, or would you have kept silent like the men in that barracks? Tell me in the comments below. By the end of that week, the laughter had died completely. The POWs who once raised their voices in mockery now spoke in low tones, glancing uneasily at the helmets they had ridiculed. The dent on Private Carter's M1 had become a legend. Inside the wire, some men whispered that it was still marked with dust from the bullet. Others claimed the guard wore it proudly as a badge of survival, whether true or not. The story carried a weight that none could ignore. Silence replaced arrogance during evening roll call. Even the most defiant officers, men who had once defended the superiority of the Stahlhelm, could no longer laugh. One captain admitted quietly to a fellow prisoner, "If each of our soldiers had worn such helmets, the graves of Stalingrad might not stretch so far." The words stung, for they acknowledged not only a failure of pride, but the sheer human cost of misplaced faith. Statistics whispered through the camp only deepened the wound. Reports claimed that by war's end, over 300,000 German soldiers had suffered head wounds, many fatal, from shrapnel and bullets that helmets failed to deflect. The numbers were not propaganda. They were the cruel mathematics of war. Against this backdrop, the American helmet seemed less like a joke and more like a lifeline forged in steel. For some POWs, the realization was personal. A former infantryman from Dresden confided to his bunkmate that his younger brother had died in Italy after a fragment pierced the side of his Stahlhelm. Would he have lived with one of these, he whispered. His eyes fixed on the ceiling beams above. No answer came, only the quiet shuffling of feet on the barracks floor. The guards noticed the change. Gone were the jeers and sneers. In their place came long stares, as if the Germans were studying the helmets not with mockery, but with a mixture of envy and regret. One black American guard, Private Samuel Johnson, overheard a prisoner mutter, "We called it a pot. Now we know it is a shield." Johnson, who had faced discrimination even within his own army, felt a rare flicker of pride as he touched the rim of his own helmet. A diary entry from Hans Becker recorded the psychological turn. "We once thought we carried the finest steel. Today, I wonder if our steel was only heavy pride. Perhaps the Americans knew better. We have been defeated not only in arms, but in the wisdom of design. And I will ask you, the listener, have you ever mocked something simple, only to later discover its quiet brilliance if you were in their place? Would you have admitted your change of heart aloud or carried it as a silent scar? Share your thoughts, because history is not only about armies, but about the humility of men. Years slipped by after the war's end, but the memory of that dented helmet never faded for those who had witnessed it. Some of the prisoners carried the image home to Germany, tucked away like a secret they rarely spoke aloud. To admit it was to confess that their laughter had been misplaced, their certainty broken by a single metallic crack in a Texas yard. Decades later, one of those men, gray-haired and stooped, found himself in a small military museum in Bonn. Behind the glass stood an American M1 helmet, its surface marked by a deep indentation. His hand pressed gently against the glass, fingertips trembling as he whispered, "I once laughed at this, but it taught me that survival does not come from pride, but from wisdom." Visitors nearby did not understand the weight of his words, but for him, that dent was louder than any battlefield memory. For others, the recollection surfaced in fragments. A farmer from Bavaria told his grandson about the day the soup pot helmet deflected death. Another man, once an officer, confessed at a veterans gathering that the sound of that ricochet haunted him more than artillery barrages. Each remembered not the chaos of Stalingrad or the noise of Normandy, but the quiet yard where arrogance was silenced by steel. The helmet itself became a symbol far beyond its function. To the Americans, it represented industry, mass production, and the determination to protect every soldier. To the Germans who witnessed its strength, it became a reminder that design is not about grandeur, but about life preserved. Over 22 million M1 helmets had been forged during the war, yet to these men, it was one dent that carried the weight of history. A former guard, Private Carter, later returned home to Ohio. He kept the helmet on a shelf in his family's farmhouse, the dent untouched, never polished away. At times, sitting at the kitchen table, he would look at it and recall the laughter of men behind the wire laughter that had turned to silence in an instant. For him, the helmet was not a trophy, but a reminder that life hangs on the narrowest edge of steel. And so the image remains a battered M1 helmet resting beneath museum lights, its dent gleaming like a scar of history. It carries with it the echo of voices that once mocked, then fell silent, then whispered in awe. A scar not of defeat or victory, but of revelation. The story of a single helmet, dented but unbroken, is not about steel alone. It is about the strange way war teaches lessons through the smallest of objects. A bullet meant to kill instead struck a curve of alloy, and in that moment, it reshaped not just the fate of one young guard, but the convictions of dozens of men watching behind the wire. The German prisoners had once trusted the weight of tradition, the silhouette of the Stahlhelm, the pride of their nation's design. But pride can blind, and symbols can deceive. What they witnessed in Texas was not the grandeur of image, but the quiet power of practicality. A helmet made not to impress, but to save. It was this difference that lingered in their minds long after the laughter had died. For some, the memory became a wound of conscience. They had marched under banners of arrogance, certain of superiority, only to discover that their enemy's strength lay in humility and innovation. For others, it became a strange comfort, proof that life could survive against chance and violence, proof that sometimes survival is not majestic, but simple, almost homely. Years later, the dented M1 helmet gleamed beneath museum lights like a scar carried into old age. Visitors walked past it, perhaps not seeing more than a piece of steel. But for those who had once laughed at its shape, that dent was a mirror of their own folly, a reminder of a day when laughter turned to silence. History often leaves us with grand battles, famous leaders, and numbers too large to grasp. Yet it is often the smallest details a dent, a diary entry, a whisper across a fence that show us the fragile line between death and survival, between arrogance and humility. And in those details, history breathes most deeply.